All right, let's talk about psychoanalytic criticism. Um, psychoanalytic criticism is based off of the works of the psychoanalysts, and the psychoanalysts are closely related to modern psychology. There are some people who say they're not really modern psychologists, and there's some people who say, well, they're so close that really they're just an earlier form of what we currently have. Um, there's sort of a divergent development to the extent that modern psychoanalysts often have slightly different focuses, even though they can still pursue sort of more modern psychological pursuits in terms of clinical psychology and whatnot that we have nowadays. Um, Psychoanalytic criticism is an attempt to apply the theories of the minds that come from psychoanalysis back to literature. And of course, the most famous psychoanalyst is Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud has a theory that basically everything comes from this sort of almost Darwinism based desire to survive and procreate. And that people have these links to sort of acts of procreation. So, for instance, you have an attachment to your parents because they represent that to you, and then eventually you will pass that on to your relationship with your partners. And that's a very gross simplification of Freud. There are critics of Freud who argue that he is very dogmatic and narrow-minded. One of Freud's students is Carl Jung, who we talked about in archetypal criticism, because Jung was very influential in setting up archetypal criticism of literature. And Carl Jung took Freud's theory and sort of expanded it. And he said, what if the psyche isn't just about sort of self-propagation? And what if it's sort of that connection to the spiritual element that exists throughout human cultures and history? So both Jung and Freud used dream analysis, which is this idea that oftentimes sort of hidden parts of what people think and who people are come out in dreams that can then be assessed and analyzed and brought into fruition. And from that dream analysis, we get criticism of literature. Basically, how are the symbols and events in stories representing something psychological? And again, Freud typically puts it in terms of sex, and Jung puts it in terms of sort of archetypal symbols. One interesting offshoot of psychoanalytic criticism is reader response theory, which is on the next slide. But the big thing to think about with psychoanalytic criticism is that it focuses on trying to get into the state of mind of the author and assess why they thought that in terms of psychological complexes. A very valid complaint about psychoanalytic criticism is that it does do a lot of cherry picking, and because of its nature as sort of doing guesswork and working from these schemas that are created by either Freud or Jung or some of their successors, they're sort of trying to fit things into patterns where there may not actually be patterns. Reader response criticism is focused on individuals' response to the text. So if you remember, one of the criticisms of new criticism, which is one of the modern forms in terms of philosophically modern, was that it really ignores the author and the reader of the work. And basically, all the other forms of criticism we've talked about focus more on the author than the reader. Reader response says, well, wait, maybe the value of literature is in what it means to people. So reader response criticism flips it on its head. It's not about what does it mean to the author, it's about what does it mean to the reader. And so reader response criticism is often focused on individuals looking at the story. Group discussion is often a reader response element, not that you won't find other critics who do discussions in groups to try and catch stuff that others are missing. But with reader response criticism, it's what you think, or what I think, that is placed at the center. There's an emphasis on pedagogy in the sense that it's often used in teaching to see, hey, what do you get from this story? And there's a value to that. There's also a pitfall with that. It looks at the goals of readers more so than the goals of writers. C.S. Lewis actually brings that up in his Experiment in Criticism, where he talks about one of the values of literature being in what it means to people rather than what it originally was designed to be. Along with the deconstructionist, reader response criticism will often mess with presentation for dramatic effect. These are for different reasons, though. And there's often some sort of postmodern elements in it, but it's not fully deconstructionist in the sense of, does your response change, for instance, if Othello is performed with a predominantly black cast and Othello is a white man? Sir Patrick Stewart was in a presentation of Othello to that extent. Does your interpretation change if all the genders are flipped? And it's worth noting reader response criticism does that for slightly different philosophical reasons than the deconstructionists. The deconstructionists are doing it to try and dismantle hierarchies and structures and get to the basis of it. Reader response criticism is just literally like, hey, are these essential parts of the experience? How does it change your experience to have these things changed? So they're very different in that sense. Next, we have semiotic criticism. Semiotic literary criticism is awesome, and it's also difficult and very obscure. Obscure not necessarily in the sense that it's inaccessible, like some of the deconstructionists are, but obscure in the sense of it breaks down into very small subfields. And so if we look at semiotic criticism, it's often called literary mathematics. And the reason for that is that it takes story elements and tries to break them down into sort of mechanical pieces. So it's like formalism applied to formalism. So for instance, an example of a story might be a Tsar has 3 daughters. The daughters go walking to overstay in the garden. The dragon kidnaps them because they overstayed. They call for help. The heroes show up. They fight the dragon and they rescue the maidens. In this case, each of them rescues one maiden. They return and they marry the basically princesses, and that's their reward for fighting the dragons. One of the things with semiotic criticism is because it's so heavily specialized. You see, I've seen it mostly in folk tales and folklore and fairy tales, this sort of semiotic approach, and it's not the only approach, but it is something where people bring up, especially because in folk tales you have these stories that are told in like small villages over the years, and one of the goals of semiotics is to look at how did those change and evolve and interact over the years. So there's a special value to semiotic criticism. Another value of semiotic criticism is machine learning. Machines telling and reading stories benefit from having this structural understanding of how stories are told. Semiotic criticism doesn't really care about the philosophical side of criticism, though. It's just breaking down stories into pieces, trying to identify those pieces and put them together in a meaningful way, in the sense that it's coherent and sensible. It's very interesting. It's also, in many ways, not artistic, which is one of the complaints that people have about it. So let's break down these 3. So psychoanalytic criticism focuses on author context, particularly the interior life of the author. Psychoanalytic criticism is cross-applicable, meaning that it often gets combined with other forms of criticism. Deconstructionist criticism loves to use psychoanalytic criticism, even though it will be equally critical of psychoanalysis as a methodology. And they typically prefer Freud to Jung when they look at stuff, because it fits their hierarchies better to have Freud, who's very much about masculine and feminine ideas. Obvious pitfalls of psychoanalysis. They cherry pick things left and right. And you really have to be careful when you're looking at psychoanalysis of, is the person doing the criticism doing this from a whole picture perspective, and are they accounting for potential contrary points in the work, or have they taken their theory and just applied it to the text, forcing it over things that might not really count? So there's that dogmatic element. In my opinion, you see more of that dogma with the Freudian approach than the Jungian approach. Some of that's my own personal bias because I like to use archetypal criticism, but some of that is also Freud and Jung have their personal differences. Jung, of course, is associated with Freud. He presents Freud as being sort of neurotic. And one of the things about Freud is he's very hesitant to admit outliers. And while Jung has sort of a systematic theory, Jung doesn't say that everyone is going to be the same. In fact, he says that people are going to be very different, and in many ways, part of the purpose of the psyche is to make us different from each other through a process he calls individuation. So with Jungian psychoanalytic criticism, you're going to get different results than Freudian psychoanalytic criticism. Reader response criticism combines a lot of theories very well. It's something that you can sort of toss on top of other things, just like psychoanalytic criticism, but it's even less sort of fixed in its ways. Reader response criticism is great for group discussion. We use it in education quite a bit because if you don't have a background in something, you can very quickly use reader response to sort of ask questions of anything very quickly, very easily. The counterpoint to that is because anyone can do reader response criticism very easily, you will also get things that don't really provide any merit to a discussion or analysis of the text from a sort of objective standpoint, where you get people saying stuff like, "Oh, I liked it." And so if you're like teaching using reader response criticism, you need to be prepared for that. It also doesn't generalize. Like as much as reader response criticism is valuable, you wouldn't want to read a paper on reader response criticism as a literary critic. It's very dry and scientific. Like you're gonna see maybe like an analysis of this is how 5,000 people responded to it instead of getting personal takeaways. And if someone is just doing their own personal takeaways in reader response criticism, it's basically worthless as an academic work. Like it doesn't really tell you anything other than, I thought it was this, I thought it was that. And the deconstructionists do that, and that's one of the flaws of deconstructionist scholarship is that they place, when they do reader response criticism, they place an undue value on that response of an individual, even though they don't necessarily consider individuals all that important in deconstructionism. And then you have semiotic criticism, where you have basically they're formalists on steroids. And one upside of that is that they have really, really deep understandings and knowledge of the functional parts of a text. If you know semiotics, there's really good ways to do these comparative studies of literature, of like even stories that are very similar. So like if you're an archetypal critic, you might not be able to catch some of the similarities and differences that a semiotic critic might. And so they're really, really good when they know their stuff, and a lot of the semiotic critics are just astonishing. The problem is that it requires a lot of effort to even be able to engage with them. Like they're geniuses, but they're almost like mad scientists. And the other downside there is that they're like, again, the exact same problems you have with the formalists, doubled. So they have the strength of the formalists to an extreme degree, and they have the weaknesses of the formalists to an extreme degree. So it's this weird sort of middle ground of, on one hand, really, really interesting textual analysis. They move away from some of the formalist focus on genre, even, though not always. It depends on which semiotics you're looking at. Obviously, generally, genre serves as a sort of bounding box for semiotics. But the counterpoint to that is you can spend a long time analyzing things that are essentially the same in semiotic criticism. So that is sort of a weakness of the school. All right, this is the last video I'm going to do on basically critical theories of literature. Or I should say literary criticism, because critical theories has its own context. If you have other schools that I haven't looked at, like I didn't look at the structuralists in depth, I just lumped them in with other deconstructionists, leave a comment below. Maybe I'll go and take a look at some things that I sort of glossed over. Like and subscribe. I'm going to go back to doing just more general writing content for a while. And then hopefully I'll see you around for that. So have a good day, everyone, and I will hopefully be uploading a video again tomorrow.